Hello, I'm Jeff Frieden, and I wrote a recent article for Finance and Development on the political economy of economic policy. The editors of Finance and Development have passed along to me some questions that readers have suggested or asked, and asked that I provide an answer. So I'm going to do that, and I hope it's useful to the readers and others in trying to clarify or expand on some issues involved in the political economy of economic policy. So the first question comes from an advisor in the Department of Public Services in Guyana. If there is a natural tendency for nations to safeguard their own citizens and space, and for vested special interests to have an outsized impact on policy, how are we to coordinate or enact a global response in time to mitigate the spread of COVID-19? Well, I think one of the points that I make in the article is that often there are forces in domestic political economies that make it difficult for governments to cooperate, forces that want the government to prioritize what's happening at home. And that's certainly true. There's no question that there are powerful political and economic forces in many instances pushing away from cooperation in favor of giving priority to domestic concerns. But there are also countervailing forces, because after all, cooperation is beneficial typically in many of these instances. And global public health is a good example. Global public health is probably the single least controversial area where there is a feeling that cooperation benefits not only other countries, but yourself. As we know, microbes, infections, diseases don't know where the national borders are. And so it doesn't make much sense to have a thoroughgoing campaign, let's say, against smallpox or measles in your border, in your country, if all the countries surrounding you haven't done it. So countries, in fact, do have an interest in global cooperation on global public health. So it seems to me that the best way to think about this is there are forces pushing in both directions. There are forces pushing in the direction of treating the local economy or the local society first and forgetting about the rest of the world. And then there are forces pushing for cooperation. The healthcare community, scientists, people who are particularly concerned about the infection in question and understand the relationship. And there has, in fact, been a lot of cooperation in global public health. If you think of global public health relative to other fields where there's nothing but competition, global public health looks pretty good. There is a WHO, controversial as it may be, and there is a commitment on the part of many, many countries to work together for global public health. So I would say that in global public health, there are a lot of forces pushing for cooperation. There are certainly forces pushing for, my country first and foremost, but the clash of these potential interests is played out in domestic politics. If we want to encourage cooperation, I think what we want to do is encourage those forces that favor and stand to benefit from cooperative efforts. And there have been cooperative efforts. Smallpox has been eradicated. That could not have been done without massive cooperation among the public health agencies around the world. And there are other instances, including in this pandemic, where the forces for cooperation have tended to prevail. The next question is related. It's from a governance expert in the Netherlands. How can we improve worldwide collaboration on things as pre-competitive as standards? For example, standards on global trade, or standards for credentials for education, standards for financial accounting, or for carbon emissions. What has to be created in order to achieve that? What power structures and incentives need to be taken into consideration? How do we globally unify standards? This is a really important question as well. Cooperation, when we talk about cooperation, we're talking about doing things that are very costly to you in order to encourage some cooperative outcome with the rest of the world. So we want everybody to do cooperative things like spend a lot of money on global public health, to go back to what I was saying before. Standards are a little different. The thing about standards is that really pretty much everyone benefits if we're all on a common standard, because it means that there's standardization, obviously, and we can realize economies of scale and things like that. So standardization is not really as serious a problem as these problems of cooperation, where countries actually have to incur large costs in favor of cooperation. When it comes to standards, usually the political conflict is a pretty straightforward one. Every country wants the global standards to be its standards, because then its firms and people don't have to adapt. So if we're talking about auto emissions in the European Union, for example, the high standard countries like Germany want everybody to come up to their standards because it gives them an advantage, gives Germany an advantage. And the low standards countries want everybody to stick with their standards. So the conflict over standardization is really trying to find a credible, acceptable solution to this conflict of standards, right? And there, I think, there's been some substantial progress in some areas. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of progress in areas that we don't even think about anymore, like electricity and the standards of electricity use, and the metric system, which not every country has adopted, but most countries have adopted the metric system because you don't want to be the one country that hasn't. In some areas, it's more difficult. Financial standards are they engage a lot of powerful interests. So it has long been hard to achieve financial standardization or harmonization, but it's happening. Within the orbit of the Bank for International Settlements, there have been has been a big increase in the standardization of financial regulatory standards. In a way, I think about this as part of a historical progression. Back in the 19th century, we had, in most countries, local regulation of health and safety, local regulation of business, local regulation of even finance and commerce. And as national markets got built, as in the United States, the national firms and the national market seemed to call out for a more cohesive set of standards. Instead of having 50 or so standards among the American states, it made sense to have one common set of federal standards. And so it took a long time because of these conflicts over what standards would be. It took a long time for a federal national standard to be adopted in the US in things like telecommunications and financial regulation and all sorts of other matters. And I think since we now live increasingly in global markets for many things, there's a pressure to standardize within those global markets as well. It's not easy, but I think that what encourages the acceptance of this standardization is moves forward that are clearly going to benefit pretty much all of the countries and all of the firms involved, because it increases the scale available to them in whatever arena they're standardizing in. So that gives me a little bit more hope for the possibility of harmonization of standards, which has happened to a very large extent within the European Union and has happened at some level with global standards in other areas. Okay, this next question is more general. It's from a civil society organization in India, and it asks, out of these two, economics and politics, which should take a front seat and which should take a back seat? Is there a rule of thumb that can help us guide decision makers? Similarly, of the two, which one is the cause and which one is the effect? Has this been quantified? Well, that gets at the core of what political economy is all about, trying to figure out not so much whether politics causes economics or economics causes politics, but how the two interact in important ways. But your question, I think, is more about how do we think about the relative importance to us as observers or policymakers of one or the other. The way I would think about this, when we're talking about pure economics, so to speak, we're typically talking about policies' impact on society as a whole, what we typically call aggregate social welfare, that is making the country as a whole better off. And there are policy areas in which there are gains to be achieved going down that path. And so we can point out that there are certain advances that can benefit the country as a whole: sanitation, public health, education, public goods for the national political economy. There may be some political hostility or some political blocks to that, but I think we can focus on the fact that certain policies are going to be good for the country as a whole, and that's, in a sense, almost pure economics. But then there's the politics, which is that even policies that are good for the country as a whole may create winners and losers. So we talk about the first as aggregate social welfare. We talk about the second as distributional. That is, they affect the distribution of wealth and income within society. And any policy that's going to affect that distribution, winners and losers, is going to be controversial. So it seems to me that the way to think about this analytically is, what are the forces pushing for these efficiency or aggregate welfare gains, and what are the forces that are concerned about who might lose from those things and who might win? And how do you reconcile those two? If you're talking about a measure that's going to eventually benefit the country as a whole, how do you deal with the people who anticipate losing as a result? If you want the country as a whole to be better off, you need to find a way to compensate or otherwise address the legitimate concerns of the people who might be losing as a result. So that's the kind of rule of thumb that I would use, that all of us are interested in aggregate welfare gains, in making poor countries richer, in making the people in poor countries, the poor in poor countries better off. Realistically speaking, if that is going to create winners and losers, you have to be pragmatically concerned about the possibility that the potential losers are going to block those changes, and be concerned about that. Not a direct answer, but doing my best to answer these very broad and very excellent and engaging questions. Okay, from a specialist working on fiscal policy and the COVID responses at the Netherlands Court of Audit. Mr. Frieden provides a nice overview of political economy, but some of his claims seem hard to substantiate. He suggests that policymakers focusing on the next election failed to prepare us for this pandemic. If this is true, one would expect less democratic forms of government to be better at anticipating long-term threats. And again, our specialist working on fiscal policy has pointed to instances in which it appears that democratic regimes did better than some democratic regimes did better than some authoritarian regimes. Absolutely true. And in pointing to elections, I'm pointing only to, or we in political economy point to only one of many things that can affect government policy. But let me stick on this particular point, which is the time horizon of policymakers. The reason we think about elections as making it, or impending elections as making it difficult for policymakers to have long-term interests or long-term goals, is that policymakers typically want to get reelected. And so they're concerned primarily about getting reelected. While authoritarian leaders, of course, don't have to worry about getting reelected, so they can have a longer time horizon. But there are many other factors that can lengthen the time horizon, even of democratic policymakers who face elections. And I think I mentioned in the article one, which is political parties. Political parties have to, an individual policymaker primarily has to worry about getting reelected in most political systems. But parties have to worry about their reputation over the much longer term. A party can't see, if a party's representative, a president or a prime minister representing a party, does something that's very short-sighted and hurts the country in the medium to long run, the party is going to suffer. By the same token, there are re-election concerns, there are reputational concerns by representatives, by policymakers themselves, people who are serving in the legislature and want to rise up through the legislature, they have reputational concerns as well. So those are just some of the characteristics that might push out the time horizon and allow more policymakers to think more long-term. And then there are other institutions. There are bureaucratic, and some call them technocratic institutions, that policymakers set up precisely to have a longer view, right? One of my favorite examples is water supply. It takes decades to build a good water supply for a major metropolitan area. In most instances, the policymakers, politicians, who set up the structures that are gonna create the reservoirs and the watershed and the water supply for the city in question, are probably not even going to be alive when the water finally arrives. And they recognize that. So they set, and they don't want it to be affected by short-term considerations. So they typically set up very, very independent agencies with a very long time horizon. So in, there's a broader point I guess I would make. When we see, when in the world, there are factors, institutions, considerations that might tend to push politics and policy in a short-sighted direction, often what we see is that over time, political systems evolve ways of counteracting that. Political parties evolved, perhaps to deal with this reputational question. Independent institutions, independent agencies like water supply agencies or central banks evolved over a long period of time to try to address some of the problems that the short-sightedness of elected politicians might create. So yes, there is an incentive for politicians to think only about the next election, right? But there are also other factors and other considerations and other institutions within political economies, within political and economic systems that counteract those trends. That may seem like an evasive answer, but it does address the, what I think is the reality of much of the social sciences, which is that for every force that we observe in society, often there is a countervailing force pushing in another direction. That's why social scientists are so often made fun of. President Truman is said to have said that he wanted a one-armed economist, so he couldn't say on the one hand, on the other hand. And we get made fun of because of this attempt to see both or many sides of a problem. But that's what makes, that's that tension between different forces, different factors, different characteristics of the political system is what makes for the reality of modern political economies and modern political systems. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this was helpful, useful, and informative. And I thank the editors of Finance and Development for giving me this opportunity to talk more about political economy. Stay safe and be well.